I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds, welcome to my horror house. In a couple of days' time I will be seeing the new Candyman movie. So to prepare, I'm going to be watching the Candyman sequels. Not the original, not the really good one, in the hope that the new Candyman movie can be the new second best Candyman movie ever made. I'm going to watch part 2 and part 3 in the 2 days leading up to it and share my thoughts and really set expectations for the Candyman sequel historically is. And we start with Candyman Farewell to the Flesh. Our film opens with a very handy recap of the legend of Daniel Robitaille, aka Candyman, in the form of a book tour being done by Professor Purcell from the first movie, the character in that movie who introduced us all to the myth of the Candyman. Well, now he's written, in the wake of the first movie, his own Candyman book, cashing in, and he finds himself in New Orleans as part of his book tour, where he can give us a handy little recap and just ties up the messy little, what happened with the ending of the first film and all of that. Well, okay, Virginia Madsen's character, Helen, everyone just assumes now that she went mad and killed people with a hook in Candyman-style killings. Don't think about it, Kay, because we're going to move on with the new movie. The setting has changed from Cabrini Green in Chicago, I think, to New Orleans in the build-up to the Mardi Gras festival, the feast before Lent. And I think it's fair to say an awful lot of Candyman Farewell to the Flesh feels like the same old story done up in slightly different looking clothes. We have another blonde-haired white woman who becomes fascinated with the story of the Candyman and decides to investigate for her own particular needs and gets entrapped in the Candyman's web of myth, legend and murder. It feels pretty much like a remix of the first film, even though it's attempting to delve back more definitively into the life and the history and the death of Daniel Robitaille. I think they've really missed a trick, because this film isn't really telling us anything we didn't already know from the first movie. And the idea of post-death Candyman, as long as his story is told he's alive, this can facilitate a transfer around the country, around the globe, if you like. And the story, the origin story, the historical facts of it, when you're dealing with a creature who survives through being an urban legend, should be permeable, should be changeable. That is the potential beauty of a character like Candyman. The origin story doesn't have to be fixed. You don't have to drill down into these facts. He can have been killed in Cabrini Green in the first movie. He could have been killed in New Orleans in the second movie. His origin story in the second movie could have been slightly different. As the telling changes, so his myth changes, but he still survives and lives on. But no, instead what we get is everything you heard about him in the first movie. We're going to show you that, but with a few more twists and a few more turns that don't really add much to the mythos so much as just make it slightly confusing. And I spent my time sort of scratching my head trying to think, what was it we knew about him from the first film, and what are they changing here, and why are those changes necessary? And they're not necessary, they just complicate matters. But the more things change, the more they stay the same. We follow a young blonde woman, Annie, who is trying to investigate the origin of the Candyman myth because her brother is currently incarcerated on suspicion of a string of Candyman-style murders. And the family have connections to the myth previously because their father was also killed in a Candyman-style slaying after he became obsessed with the Candyman legend. What's the only answer to this? It's to dig into the legend and ultimately, eventually, to to test the truth of it and to say Candyman 5 times into a mirror. The change of scenery adds, for me, nothing apart from just the uneasy sense that the writers were scouring around for, where can we find another disenfranchised black community to set this story in? We are treated to very generic movie Mardi Gras set pieces and the use of a god-awful DJ voiceover exposition, this horrible DJ character, Kingfish, who is trying to get everyone whipped up for Mardi Gras by constantly reminding them of Candyman and telling us, the audience, all the things we need to know. These are the themes of the movie, audience. Do you understand? We're not going to explore them in any kind of depth or nuance like the first film did. My character is literally here to talk to you about what this movie is about. And I'll pop up and be annoying once every 15 or 20 minutes. Okay? Which is a real shame because there is potential here. I like me a slice of Southern Gothic. So have an unsolved murder, have a family with secrets, an old family house that's now gone to rack and ruin that is tied in with this other historical figure from the area who is now a supernatural entity. All of this stuff should be nice and juicy, ripe for really getting into the idea of what Candyman is and can be. It's all just set dressing, unfortunately. Everything really essentially all boils down to the terrible family secret that, shock horror, they've got some black ancestors in the family tree. And that would be fine, and that would be worth exploring if the movie wasn't more intent on being much more of a generic 90s slasher than its forebear, which I think is one of the most thoughtful and layered horror movies ever, let alone the 90s. Philip Glass returns to score this movie, which is in its favour, that sort of synthy, choral, chord progression stuff really adds to the Candyman flavour. Glass, for some reason, not reprising his absolute earworm of a refrain from the first film. His score for Farewell to the Flesh sometimes alludes to it. I don't know if he's doing something really fancy musically, but the most famous refrain from the first movie has, since I watched part 2, been going round and round in my head, even though it doesn't feature in the second movie. The most famous hook from his original score seems to haunt this movie in its absence. Strange trick to pull off, but I guess he's pulled it off. I don't know why you would want to do that. It's one of the pluses. The second and major plus for Farewell to the Flesh is, of course, Tony Todd. He's given less to do. He's given much more generic 90s slasher stuff to do. The lines he is given are worse. It's almost as if some of the beautiful dialogue he was given in the first film was put through auto-translate and then translated back into English, but he still gives it that sense of gravitas and melancholy with that deep, sort of menacing yet honeyed voice that he's got. He's still a formidable presence as Candyman. Professor Purcell at the start of the movie describes his sorrow and hate fill his eyes, and this is the duality of Candyman, and something that you really do get to explore more, the tragedy of his origins in this film. There are layers to Candyman / Daniel Robitaille that lend the character to, I think, a very, very strong affiliation to the original Universal monsters, who tended to be sort of loner, outsider and tragic figures. Candyman is much more in the Dracula mould, sort of cursed, educated, artistic, sort of soul of a poet, cursed to be a monster. He has much more affiliation to these classic Universal monsters than he does, I think, to a Jason Voorhees or a Freddy Krueger. And seeing Tony Todd inhabit that character is always worth it. It is therefore a real pity that Candyman 2 has no tension, no scares. It is rather dull and pedestrian. It looks flat. There's nothing surprising about it visually. The scares that come are almost, to a man, a tired old repetition of one character being shocked by the arrival of a second character with a little musical sting. The first film definitely explored the idea of poverty tourism and how Helen Lyle, as this privileged middle-class educated woman, will use the life experience of these disenfranchised people for her thesis. Here Annie is working amongst them and with them. She's an art teacher at a local school and teaches an awful lot of these kids. So that sort of poverty tourism or poverty pornography isn't present there. And yet the film uncomfortably manages, more so than the first film, to portray this community in a way that sort of others them and distances them from our blonde, white protagonist. I don't think the themes and the subtext of the Candyman story and the first movie were thought of as deeply for the second one. I think it reads like it's more a case of, let's have some more of the same. A disenfranchised or poor black community. They believe in the myth. We'll have a white woman investigating it. She doesn't believe. She calls on Candyman, so people get sliced up with a hook. It's a little bit boring and it's a little bit repetitive. What I do remember that it is, though, is that I remember it is significantly better than Candyman 3, which I will be watching next. And I remember that being a stinker. So, hoo boy, I'm not looking forward necessarily to that. But I'm hoping that it's going to be an excellent palate cleanser for me to come to the new Candyman movie fresh and willing to be impressed.